Starting. Great. So thank you everyone for being here on the eve of the Local Energy Solutions Conference. For those who don't know, tomorrow, Friday, we're going to be gathering for our big show of the year at the Doubletree Conference Center in Manchester. And I hope that I will see many of you there. And if there are those of you who don't have a ticket, just know there are still tickets available because we sort of reformatted how everything is set up so that we could have more attendees. So clear your calendars, it's not too late. Really happy to be doing this webinar in advance of the conference. The folks at CPCNH will be talking about this program tomorrow, but we thought that something that was aimed specifically at developers who might have more granular questions would be really valuable, considering that the LES conference is sort of the big tent. And so that's what we're hoping to provide with you all here today. A chance to hear about what CPCNH is planning, which we are very excited about, as well as a chance to ask them questions directly that potentially could shape the offering that they're developing, since it's still, as of yet, I believe, not quite finalized. So, Mark, would you mind hopping to the next slide? Just a reminder that Clean Energy New Hampshire is a member organization, and we are powered by our members. So if there are those of you who are interested in New Hampshire and starting to develop projects here, if you're already developing projects and you're not a member, I would really hope that you consider becoming a member. We are really proud of all the work that we've done in pretty difficult political environment here in New Hampshire. And we think that we're very effective at moving policies through and defending policies that exist that are encouraging of the development of the renewable energy industry. So think about it. CPCNH is one of our newest members, so happy to have them as part of the team, and happy to have all of us sort of rowing together in the same direction to try to open up the clean energy economy. Mark, next slide. And with that, I'm going to hand it off to Brian Callnan. So Brian is the CEO of the Community Power Coalition of New Hampshire. If you don't know who CPCNH is, I'll leave it to him to lay out what they do. They are, in my own words, I would say CPCNH is the newest institution on the energy scene in New Hampshire, and they are actively shaking up how energy is being delivered in the state, as well as the potential for the development of exciting new projects and programs, and innovative new approaches to how we deliver energy in the state. And so I'm really excited to be partnering with them on this and many other initiatives. So Brian, take it away.
Hey, Sam, thanks so much. And thanks to everybody for taking some time today to walk through this program design with us. It's very important for us to hear back from you. So I hope everyone's can jot questions down, use the chat. Sam's going to help us with that so we can try to answer those questions during the webinar. But we really want to get some feedback from the developer community as to, hey, we've got a new program that we want to launch next year. Will anybody show up? And does it make sense to anybody? Mark's going to jump into that in more detail as we get through the webinar. I hope everybody does go to LES tomorrow. It's going to be a great conference, and many thanks to Beth and Sam and the CENH team for making the time to have a webinar ahead of it. I know they're probably slammed busy trying to clean up all the last minute things that happen right before a conference. Community Power Coalition in New Hampshire, we are helping develop and put community power programs throughout the state. We started delivering actually default service products to community power aggregations in April of last year, really at the beginning of May. And we at that point, we had 14 communities that we're delivering services to. And now we're delivering services. We have members, 68 members, of which we have 70 communities that are represented there, 74 actually. So excited to have Mark Bolinger do this webinar for us. Just a little background on Mark. Mark is our Director of Programs and Projects, and he comes to us from Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratories, where he spent the last 25 years as a research scientist reporting on renewable energy. So we're very fortunate to have Mark on the CPCNH team. And I know that you're going to have a great webinar for that. So turning it over to Mark.
Great. Thank you, Brian, and good afternoon, everybody. I too want to thank you for joining us today, and I want to thank the CENH folks, Beth and Sam in particular, for setting this up for us. So let me jump right in. The purpose of today's webinar, as Brian mentioned, is really to seek feedback from all of you, the developer community, on this new solicitation program that we are hoping to launch early next year. We've modeled this program after Vermont's standard offer program that ran for about a decade before sunsetting just a few years ago. So my guess is that some of you, perhaps many of you, may have participated in that program or at least probably heard of it. If that's the case, much of what I'll be presenting today should look fairly familiar to you. But even if you're not familiar with that program, we really want your feedback on this program that we'll be talking about and how to make it better. And as was mentioned, there are kind of two ways you can provide that feedback. During the webinar, you can use Zoom's Q&A button to submit any questions or comments. Sam is going to be monitoring the Q&A during the webinar, and he will throw questions out either during the presentation or after during a live Q&A session. After the webinar, if something else comes to mind, you can always feel free to reach out to me. I've inserted my email address here at the bottom of the slides. Let me know your thoughts, or we can also set up a time to talk. Always happy to hear what you're thinking. So here's a kind of a high-level overview of what I'll be presenting. I'll start off with just a little bit of information about who we are, who CPCNH is. With any luck, we are likely to be counterparties to some or perhaps many of you on renewable generation projects going forward. And so we feel like you should know a little bit about who we are. And then I'll have just a one-slide high-level overview of this program before getting into some of the details, such as what types of projects are eligible, what forms of support do we plan to provide, what are we willing to pay or what are we able to pay, which will presumably be of great interest. And then we'll talk about some of the kind of the more administrative details, such as timelines, milestones, submission requirements, what type of security we'll be looking for. And then I'll conclude the webinar with a list of questions that kind of came to me as I was looking through my slides. These are questions that we would particularly appreciate your feedback on. So we'll run through those before moving into live Q&A. So Brian's already told you a little bit about CPCNH. We are a community-governed, nonprofit joint powers agency set up a couple of years ago to serve the growing number of community power aggregations, or CPAs, that have been forming throughout the state. Our mission is to foster resilient New Hampshire communities by empowering them to realize their energy goals. And we accomplish that mission by jointly contracting for services, most notably all requirements electricity service, by also developing projects and programs together, which is part of what this solicitation is about. And then there's also a pretty strong educational and advocacy component as well. We are pretty active before the New Hampshire DOE and the PUC, as well as the legislature. As Brian mentioned, we have 68 municipal and county members throughout the state. In aggregate, those members represent about 40% of New Hampshire's population. We are currently serving about 175,000 electricity accounts. And since we started serving load in April of 2023, we have saved our customers more than $16 million compared to the utility prices that they would otherwise have been paying. Perhaps most pertinent here is this last bullet. In 2025, we are expecting 1.5 terawatt hours of load, and we anticipate that that will continue to grow. Here is a current snapshot of our membership. Every community that you see here in blue or red font is an operating community. The red font just indicates that they just launched as part of Wave 4 this month, so they're newly operating. And by operating, I mean that we are providing electricity service in these all of these communities that are shaded here in blue. This slide just provides a little bit of information on the 4 primary electricity products that we do provide. You can see them in the top of the table there. They each have slightly different or very different renewable energy content. And to date, the way that we've done this is we've supplied these products by purchasing power in the wholesale market and then greening up that supply by purchasing RECs, unbundled RECs, from third-party brokers. We're trying to change that with this solicitation by contracting directly with new renewable generators for at least a small portion of our supply. So that's what this solicitation is all about. So here's a high-level overview of the program. Our vision is to launch a recurring RFP program that'll enable us to competitively procure energy and/or RECs and possibly capacity from new renewable generation projects via long-term contracts. So every year we will release an RFP that will specify a certain amount of capacity that we're looking for. We are initially targeting 20 megawatts, which, if all goes well, would put us on track to have 100 megawatts under contract by 2030. So that's kind of our midterm goal, and that's also obviously where the title of this webinar came from. So respondents to the RFP could include a wide variety of different types of projects, including different types of renewable resources, whether that's solar or wind or hydro or what have you, different project sizes or capacities, and also different project structures. And we'll talk about each of those things in a minute. And for each of those different combinations or permutations of resource, size, and structure, we will specify a price cap or a ceiling price above which we will not entertain proposals. So to say that another way, every RFP will include a table with a bunch of prices, which indicate the ceiling price that we're willing to pay. And if you, as the developer, have a project or more than one, hopefully, that can meet or beat those prices, we would love to see a proposal from you. And we're hoping that there will be many of you in that situation, and we'll be able to foster a little bit of competition that will ideally lead to better pricing for our members. Competition is one of the 3 sort of foundational pillars on which this program is built. The other 2 are standardization to reduce transaction costs, not only for us, but also for you, the developers, and also transparency in the sense that with these ceiling prices, we'll be sending a transparent price signal not only to you all, but also to other stakeholders like policymakers as to the value that these different types of projects provide to the market. So there's a certain amount of kind of an educational component there as well. Okay, so let's talk in a little more detail about eligible projects. As I mentioned, we'll include a wide array of renewable resources, pretty much running the gamut there. You'll notice battery storage is not included there. We've opted to leave that out of this year's solicitation, in part because we're not able to monetize the full benefits of storage, but we are hoping to remedy that, in which case we will include storage probably in the second year of the program. In terms of vintage, our current thinking is that only new resources will be allowed to participate. But I want to emphasize that we do understand the importance of keeping existing resources online and operating. And so if there are any existing resources out there that are kind of wondering what their next step is after coming off of their current contract, we would certainly be open to discussions there, but we prefer to do that outside of this program. In terms of capacity, we do intend to impose a minimum project size. As you can see here, I've slotted in 100 kW. That feels a little low to me, so we might bump that up, but at present, that's our current thinking. There will be no capacity limit on the upper end other than the overall RFP capacity limit, which I mentioned earlier. At least we'll start off at probably around 20 megawatts. And then in terms of project structure, we're going to open the program to 3 different types of projects listed here: registered generators with ISO New England, load reducers, and group net metering projects. And on the next 3 slides, I'm going to provide more details on each one of these. So ISO New England generator, this is simply a project that registers with ISO New England as a generator, meaning that the project will participate in the ISO's energy and capacity markets. These tend to be larger projects. There's no upper limit on capacity. So these will most often be greater than 5 megawatts. In fact, if you've got a program, or if you've got a project, sorry, that is less than 5 megawatts, we would prefer to see you not register if you're hoping to participate in this program. So above 5 megawatts, you have to register. Below, we would prefer to see you not do that in order to provide some flexibility down the line if there are regulatory or legislative changes that enable us to capture more value from your project. Because these are bigger projects participating in wholesale markets, they can be sited outside of the state, but obviously they have to remain within New England. And the way we value these is to look at their energy capacity and REC value. The next category is what's known as a load reducer. So this is a project that is less than 5 megawatts and interconnected to the local distribution grid. So it's got to be in New Hampshire, obviously. And this project does not register with the ISO. It forgoes registration, which also means that it's not participating in the energy and capacity markets. But by injecting its output into the local distribution market, what it does do is it reduces the amount of energy, capacity, transmission, and ancillary services that must be purchased from the wholesale market. So it provides a lot of value by avoiding those costs. It also avoids transmission and distribution line losses, which provides a little bit of a kicker. And there's also a capacity multiplier in the sense that if you can kind of provide capacity locally on the distribution system, that avoids the need to have to purchase some multiplier of that amount of capacity. We estimate it at around 1.4, so basically 40% multiplier, due to the way that ISO New England procures capacity. So that's also a nice kicker. And then presuming these load reducers are renewables, you'll also get the REC value, obviously. So as you might gather from this, the center of this slide, load reducers, have the potential to provide a whole lot of value. They cover, virtually almost every monetizable aspect of the value stack. But unfortunately, we can't realize that full value for 2 reasons, really. First is our inability to monetize transmission value. So utilities obviously control the transmission part of the bill. We only have access to the supply portion of the bill, so we're not able to monetize that avoided transmission value at present. And then the second reason has to do with something known as load settlement, which on its own is a pretty complicated topic. So I'm not going to get into that, or I'm going to try not to get into that. But suffice it to say that because of the way that load settlement is conducted in New Hampshire, we are greatly restricted in the amount of value that we can extract from load reducers. Currently, we can only extract about 15% of the value of energy, capacity, and ancillary services. And that 15% has to do with, or it's directly proportional to, the percentage of load that CPCNH serves in different utility service territories. So I'll leave it at that, but the bottom line is load reducers have a lot of value, but we can't currently monetize much of that. And then the third type of project that we will entertain through this solicitation program is group net metering, which might seem like a little bit of an odd duck for a solicitation program. So I'm going to spend a little more time on this later. But as most of you probably know, group net metering involves a host, which is the generator, and then group members who subscribe to the generator's output. The host has to be less than 5 megawatts and sited locally in New Hampshire, and the group members have to be in the same utility service territory as the host. The value of a group net metering project is based primarily on the current net metering tariff, which is potentially subject to change. There is an ongoing proceeding on kind of what comes next for net metering. So, what I've listed here is the current value, but that could change going forward. We'll have to see. And the way that we think about these group net metering projects is to value them based on the regulated tariff, which for projects over 100 kilowatt will be just the utility default supply rate. And then we also add in the REC value. So the type of support that we provide to each one of these 3 different types of projects depends in part on how large the project is and also what type of project it is. So I guess starting over on the right-hand side of this table, for both ISO New England generators and load reducers, what we will be offering is a bundled power purchase agreement, or PPA. This is a pretty standard way of doing things. It's just a long-term contract that packages together energy, RECs, and potentially capacity at a fixed price. I suspect that's totally familiar to most of you, so I won't say any more about that. For group net metering, this one's a little different. As I mentioned, group net metering is kind of an odd duck for a solicitation program, but also for CPCNH for reasons that I'll get into in just a minute. So we've struggled a little bit to kind of figure out what our role should be here. And where we've landed is that we can probably provide the highest value by purchasing the project's RECs. And the way we'd like to do that is through this mechanism that's known as a contract for differences, or CFD. In a nutshell, a CFD kind of allows us to purchase RECs at a floating price that varies inversely with movements in the net metering credit over time. And what that enables is if you kind of add together the floating REC price and the variable net metering credit, what a CFD allows us to do is kind of translate that variable revenue stream into a fixed revenue stream for the project host. And we're hoping that will be desirable. Before I address the orange part here, I also want to mention that CPCNH has also recently become a REC aggregator. So for projects that fall below this 100 kW threshold, we will be able to aggregate their RECs. So keep that in mind as well. So as I mentioned earlier, some of you may be kind of wondering how group net metering really works moving through a solicitation program. So I wanted to talk a little bit more about that. As I mentioned, we were struggling to kind of figure out how to add value to net metering projects. And that is because we are not a natural counterparty to a group net metering transaction. We're not a natural host because we don't currently foresee project ownership in the near future. That may be in the cards down the road, but in many ways, we're just getting started and ownership seems a little premature at this point. To be a host, we'd also have to be on utility default service, which, as you can imagine, would be a little bit awkward for us. We're also not a natural group member because we ourselves don't have much load. It's our members CPAs that really have the load. So we don't really belong in the transaction itself, but we feel like we can still play 2 important roles. One is to draw upon the strong working relationships that we've developed with our member communities to help form the group and then manage it over time. Perhaps more importantly, we think we could certainly purchase the project's RECs. We need to buy a lot of RECs every year, and this could be one way to accomplish that. And as I mentioned, we've come up with this, well, we haven't come up with it, but we've adapted this CFD mechanism for this purpose, and we think that it could provide value not only to us, but also to you as the host. So I just wanted to kind of quickly walk through an example of what I'm talking about here when it comes to the REC CFD. So what you're looking at is an example of a REC contract for differences in a group net metering setting. And this is based on Eversource's rate history going back to 2010 and assuming a group net metering project that requires 10 cents per kilowatt hour of revenue. So I'm just going to walk you through each line on the graph here. So the purple line up top represents Eversource's default supply rate going all the way back through 2010. So many of you probably remember the big price spike of 2022 and 2023. And if you assume that the project that we're focusing on here is greater than 100 kilowatts, then that default supply rate also equals the net metering credit. So those two are the same. In order to entice group members to subscribe to your project, you need to offer them a portion of the net metering credit. So in this example, we have assumed that you will give them 15% of the credit, and that's what's shown by the blue shaded area. What that means is that the host retains the remaining 85% of the net metering credit. That's the green shaded area. And within the parlance of contract for differences, that 85% of the net metering credit is referred to as the index. The black dashed line that you see here is the developer's revenue requirement. That is a flat 10 cents per kilowatt hour. And within the lingo, that is referred to as the strike price. And then the final line that you see here is the floating rec price that CPCNH would pay. And that price is calculated by subtracting the index, so subtracting the host share of the net metering credit from the strike price, which is the host revenue requirement. And you can see there that it's kind of a mirror image of the net metering credit. And so the idea here is that when you combine the host share of the net metering credit, the 85% share, and the floating rec price, what you end up with is this flat 10 cent per kilowatt hour line. And that, by the way, that 10 cents per kilowatt hour is the price that the host would have offered into the solicitation. So that's how the CFD works, and that's how we see group net metering sort of fitting into the solicitation program. Okay, let's talk about what we can pay. As I mentioned, we're going to establish a set of ceiling prices, which set an upper limit on what we're able to pay. Those ceiling prices will reflect the projected value of the project to us over a 20-year term. And that value is going to vary based on what type of resource it is, whether you're talking about solar versus wind versus landfill gas, given the different generation profiles that each of those resources has, generating at different times of the day or different times of the year. It might also vary by project size or capacity. And I'm thinking in particular there about the net metering tariff varying whether you're above or below 100 kilowatts. And then finally, it will also vary by project structure, given that, depending on which type of project you are, you'll have access to different elements of the value stack. So here we see our initial assessment of value broken out here by both resource and project structure. So across the x-axis, we've got solar here on the left, wind in the middle, and then over on the right, we've got the resources that aren't directly weather impacted. They're not variable based on hourly weather fluctuations. And within each of those resource groupings, we've got our three different project types: load reducers, group net metering, and registered generators. And then you can see that each column kind of has different elements of the value stack. So across all of these different projects, we've got a constant rec value shown there in orange. The blue represents energy value, green capacity value, pink transmission, and the dark blue up top is ancillary services. And then for the group net metering, the gray area there just represents the value of the net metering credit. So what you see here is that in all three, or for all three resources, the highest value comes from load reducers, which is what we would have expected, just given that they have that they provide transmission value, and also have some of those kickers that I was talking about earlier. Followed by group net metering, and then finally the ISO New England registered generators. So, this is our estimate of the value that these projects will provide. So ideally, this would be the amount that we would be willing to pay for projects that fall into these categories. And that is indeed the case for both group net metering and registered generators. But unfortunately, it's not the case for load reducers. As I mentioned earlier, we are not able to fully capture the value of load reducers, which means that their ceiling prices are going to be just a fraction of their full value. And again, the reason that we cannot capture the full value is because A, we can't monetize transmission. Transmission is on the utility portion of the bill. And then B, this load settlement issue that I've been kind of skirting around here. It's a serious regulatory challenge to us when it comes to monetizing the benefits of load reducers. And at present, the amount of value from a load reducer that we're able to capture is basically directly proportional to the amount of load that we serve in a given utility service territory. And right now, that's in at least 2 of the 3 utility service territories, that's around 15%. So this graph here is, essentially the same graph that I just showed on the prior slide, but in this case, I've added one more column showing the value of the load reducer if we assume that we can only capture 15% of the value of energy capacity and ancillary services. And you can see that the number is quite low. So even though we would be very happy to pay $108 per megawatt hour for a solar load reducer, in reality, we are limited to paying just $30 because that corresponds to the value that we can actually capture. And obviously $30 is going to be well below the number that you all need to make load reducer projects work. So we're not expecting to see a whole lot of those, at least under the current situation. Instead, we're guessing we'll see more group net metering projects and registered generators. So that's the bad news. The good news is that we are actively working to fix load settlement. We're working in the regulatory and legislative arena, and also in concert with the utilities to try and get this fixed. And I guess what I want to say here is that once we get load settlement fixed, not only will new solicitations reflect that in terms of higher ceiling prices for load reducers, but any existing contract that we've already entered into, say for a group net metering project, we will work with you to kind of reopen that contract, to try to restructure it in the way that provides the highest value. If that's a load reducer, we would look to shift it over to acting in that capacity. And to the extent that we're able to capture additional value by doing that, we will share that value with you. So we're willing and happy to share the upside of the additional value that a load reducer can provide once we get this problem fixed. All right, so let's move on to talk about just kind of a typical time frame here, what the annual cycle looks like, as well as what some of the milestones are. So we're hoping to launch this in early 2025, and between now and then, we will incorporate your feedback from this webinar, continue to tweak the program design, and hopefully get ready for a launch in late January or early February. Proposals will be due in March. We'll announce the winners in April. In May, we will issue contracts, and that really triggers the first milestone. Once we issue those contracts, we will expect them to be executed within 30 days, which I don't anticipate will be a problem because we plan to use a fairly standardized contract that will be essentially non-negotiable. So that should not be a problem. Once you've executed that contract, you will then have 12 months to obtain all federal, state, and local permits that you need to operate. And you will also have 18 months from contract execution in order to reach COD, commercial operation. And if that 18 months sounds tight, I guess I just want you to keep in mind that this timeline that we've laid out here does in fact provide 2 full construction seasons in which to work on your projects. And I want to emphasize that this is an annual program, so every year we'll be doing the same thing, putting out a new RFP. And so our hope is that will encourage you to only bring us your fully baked projects, and you can save your half-baked projects or quarter-baked for a future solicitation. So you can have some confidence that there will be other opportunities down the road. Because if you miss a milestone, if you bring us a project that's not quite ready and then you miss a milestone, that will result in forfeiture of the contract, and any capacity that is freed up as a result, we'll either allocate that to a project that's been waiting in the wings as part of a reserve group that we will have established back in April, or we might just tack it on to the next year's capacity limit for the solicitation. So instead of doing 20 megawatts next year, maybe we do 25. And so this is kind of the plan to do this every year. So it's kind of a rinse and repeat thing. Yeah, I'm hoping that timeline works out and makes sense. In terms of submission requirements, when you submit your proposal in March, you must have site control. You must have completed and submitted a full interconnection application. And we are also going to require security deposits of $25 per kilowatt in total. So a portion of that, $10 per kilowatt, will be due at the time of proposal submission, with another $15 coming if you're awarded a contract. Those are refundable, presuming you don't miss any milestones. And these amounts and this structure we pulled directly from the Vermont program. So we would be interested in your feedback on this, whether this works, whether it's too onerous or too lenient. Please let us know. Okay, so at this point, I'm going to talk a little bit, just run through a few of these frequently asked questions just to emphasize a few points. First one, what happens if we get no proposals? After seeing the ceiling prices that I showed you, my guess is there are probably some of you out there thinking they're never going to get any proposals. That may well be, we hope not. But even if that does happen, there is a silver lining there. As I mentioned, there is sort of an educational component to this program. And so even if we don't get any proposals, we will have at least signaled to stakeholders, i.e. policymakers. We'll have let them know the value that we think we can capture from these projects given the current market circumstances. And they will also see that we were not able to contract with any projects that were able to meet those prices. And that hopefully will send some sort of message that something needs to change. For example, maybe load settlement needs to be fixed. So we're hoping we're never in this situation, but even if we are, there is a silver lining there in the sense of kind of raising awareness. If we get too many proposals, we will rank them, of course, based on price. But if that isn't able to settle it, we'll call on other criteria, which we'll lay out in the RFP. And we also reserve the right to kind of pull capacity forward from future solicitations if we just love every project that we're seeing. Maybe we do a little extra this year and a little less than what we had planned next year. Again, I want to emphasize this third point here, what happens when load settlement gets fixed. And I'm going to broaden it out a little bit to not just load settlement, but if there are any other kind of regulatory or legislative changes that happen at any point during a project's contract term, we will actively work with the project to capture any additional value that's available. And presuming we're able to make that happen, we will share the upside with you. Some of you are probably wondering about credit from a counterparty perspective. We do not currently have a credit rating, but we are actively working towards obtaining a credit facility. And who is the counterparty from a credit perspective will depend in part maybe on the project type. It could be us in some cases. It could possibly be Calpine Community Energy, which is one of our partners. They currently serve as our load serving entity. But this is something that we will probably need to discuss more kind of on a one-on-one basis. And then storage, I already mentioned that we're not doing it this year, but we hope to bring it in future years once we get load settlement fixed. All right, last slide here. Just some questions that we would especially appreciate feedback on, if you're able. So I mentioned the minimum project size of 100 kW. We had originally set it there thinking that it might be nice to capture at least a few projects that are able to access the transmission and distribution component of the net metering tariff. So that's why it's there, but maybe that's too low from a transaction cost perspective. So let us know what you think there. I ran through the long-term REC CFD, and I'm just curious whether that's attractive and how it stacks up relative to what you're doing at present, which is presumably more of a kind of a multi-year fixed price REC strip. Security deposits, too lenient, too onerous, about right, $25 per kW. In terms of time to bring your project online, 18 months, how does that feel? Is that too tight? We've been assuming contract duration of 20 years, but would be curious to know if if you all could make 10 or 15 years work. That would be nice to know. And then I guess just more broadly, is there anything that you see in here that will potentially hinder your participation? Our goal here is to have as broad a participation as possible. So if there's something in here that looks like a deal killer, please let us know. And then of course, feedback need not be limited to these 6 questions. We'd really welcome any thoughts you have on this program. Our goal is to make this as good of a program as we can, so that we can hopefully hit our goal of 100 megawatts by 2030. And with that, I will thank you for your attention and thank you in advance for your feedback. Both Brian and I will be at the Local Energy Solutions Conference tomorrow, and my guess is Sam will be as well. I know he will be. So we hope to see you there. Come by and grab us if you'd like to chat about this more. And I guess at this point, maybe I'll turn it back to Sam to see if we have any questions.
Yeah, so I only just realized that for some reason I couldn't see the questions earlier, so I had to join. I had to leave and rejoin once I realized that, and now I can see them, but I'm only seeing the ones that were posted since I rejoined. So Brian, I'll need your help as to questions that were pitched in earlier. But I'm seeing one that's popping up quite a lot, which is the PPA rate fixed for 20 years, or is there an escalator?
So we're looking at that as a levelized PPA. So I guess the answer would be fixed, although, if it's a levelized number, we could potentially, tilt it to be lower in the early years and higher in the later years. But I guess for now, think of it as fixed price flat.
All right, so that's in several questions. So I'm gonna scroll down. This actually is one that popped into my head as well. So is CPCNH's position firm that there'll be absolutely no negotiation of contract terms with a selected proposal? This may be challenging for developers, particularly with binding milestones. For example, development is a challenging business. There are many unknowns with third-party constraints coming up during the permitting process that are out of the developer's control. So thoughts on that? I'm going to keep reading this question and see how you do. See if your answer answers the second half of that question.
Yeah, so I would say, our goal obviously is no negotiation. We want to make this as standardized as possible to keep the transaction costs down. These are fairly small projects, and so we don't want to spend a lot of time negotiating contracts. So that would be our starting point. Whether we can hit that in reality, I guess remains to be seen. I'd be curious. I think under the Vermont program, it was no negotiation as far as I understand, in part because the administrator of that program did not have the authority to negotiate. We're in a little bit of a different situation, given that this is not a state mandated program. But yeah, I guess I would say no negotiation. That's our goal. That's our starting point. And we'll see how it goes. I don't know. Brian can jump in there if he has other thoughts.
No, Mark, that's the right answer. The project themselves, the contract itself is what I meant to say. The contract itself will be available for folks to review. If we get feedback on that, that there are some hurdles in there, that's not great for this overall offering. We want people to be able to participate. So we'd want to see that feedback. But to Mark's point, the contract was really, we modeled it almost directly off of what the Vermont programs were, and that ran for about a decade. So we're hoping to learn from their experience in removing the hurdles that folks had.
I was similarly curious about whether the 18-month timeline was fixed, in particular because I know interconnection delays has been a huge problem for the developer community in New Hampshire, and so just thoughts on that.
Yeah, so that is our current thinking, that we're hoping that 18 months can work. We realize that might be a little tight given interconnection challenges. We are, of course, aware that the New Hampshire DOE is opening up a proceeding to ideally improve that situation, and we're hoping that that bears fruit. But again, provide us your feedback on how you feel about that. All the developers should feel free to chime in on that.
We have a question from Beth McGinn, which I'm a little confused as to what the question is. Given New Hampshire's net metering cap, can greater than 1 megawatt AC be generated for CPCNH? So I believe this is referring to I mean, there's obviously several programs here. But I'm curious if you want to try to answer that again, Mark.
Yeah. Yeah, my guess is that Beth is asking whether, if the project is over 1 megawatt, whether like CPCNH can be a group member in that case. So that would be like a municipal host project, whether we can serve as a group member. And I think, I think that's what we were trying to accomplish maybe with HB 1600 from last year's session, which ultimately did not pass. But so I guess the answer is no at present. It would have to be individual governmental loads. So we ourselves could not serve as a group member in that case.
Gotcha. All right. So this question goes right over my head, but I'll see if you guys get it. What is the purpose of the security deposit? What are you securitizing?
Yeah, so there, we just want to make sure that we get real projects. We're going to spend some administrative, we will incur some administrative expenses, obviously, running this program and reviewing proposals and things like that. We only want to be evaluating projects that are actually quote unquote real. And one way to demonstrate that a developer is committed to a project is to, put up a little money that they'll hopefully get back if the project comes online. But it's basically just a show of confidence on the developer's part that they're willing to follow through with the project should we select it.
Yeah, I can add into that too, Mark. I think what we learned in working with Vermont on this was that this is one of the things that they received feedback from, not just actually from the developers themselves, because folks were kind of bidding at projects but not actually developing them, so they were missed out on the actual capacity of that year. So the recommendation from the developer community was to have a fairly good deposit.
Will bids be public?
Oh, I saw that one. Hello, David. Yes, the hope is that bids will be public. So Mark talked about this earlier, that there's a very large education component for our members in this. We haven't decided, so this is a draft program. Do we make just the awards public or do we make all bids public? So there's a distinction there, which we haven't really worked out completely, but the idea is to try to make this as transparent as possible so that our members can learn what these projects are costing, as well as other developers get to see where prices are coming in.
And maybe just to add an addendum onto that, I there may be some sensitivity as to what development costs are, and there may be a desire from some developers to have certain numbers be redacted from public information. Is that a consideration that's potentially possible?
The hope is to have the actual the bids that are be putting in for each individual project itself would be kind of an all-in component, not separated out. So those would be kind of hidden from view. That you obviously it would be in the overall price. So you might see a component there, but if we're not going to be asked to have prices separated out, like there won't be, this is what you would be offering for energy, or this is what you'd be offering for RECs and capacity. It'd be an all-in price.
So I think I'm going to take Malcolm Bliss's questions, and try to roll them into one. And I think what I'm seeing is some concern about the pricing generally. So Malcolm says, concerned that the prices are too low to get interest. For example, an ISO New England generator right now can get $80 to $95 through a sleeved PPA or virtual PPA. And the ceiling price for ISO projects in this program is $76. We have similar concerns on the DG side that projects may be able to get more value through a group net metering model. And then there's a question above that I think sort of speaks to this as well. So for RECs, solar projects can likely get and will continue to be able to trade into Massachusetts for class 1 RECs that can get $35 to $50 per megawatt hour. So that's sort of the marketplace that you're competing in.
Yeah, and I would just say, we hear that. We're kind of constrained in only being able to pay what we're able to actually extract from the projects. Otherwise, we'd be operating at a loss. We're a nonprofit, but we have to at least cover our expenses. But I will also say that I think you mentioned that someone wrote that they could potentially see more value in the group net metering market. And I'll just reemphasize that we are including group net metering projects within this solicitation. So you could think of our desire to purchase RECs from those projects as kind of an overlay on top of what you all are already doing in the group net metering market. So I don't think these two things are mutually exclusive at all. If group net metering is where the highest value lies, that can work within our program. And I guess I'll also just say that, we've talked to a few developers that have projects that are sort of in the vicinity of the numbers that I showed. So, sure, not every project is going to be able to hit those cutoffs, but hopefully some will.
And I think this is sort of a follow-on regarding that program specifically for Malcolm. So in the contract for differences, essentially $99 per megawatt hour is the strike price. And if the market is above that, then CPCNH gets the upside. If it's below that, the developer gets the strike price, correct?
I don't think I'm not quite sure I understand that what is put in that terminology, but basically what the developer is going to get is the price that it offers into the solicitation. So if that's, I think the example I used was 10 cents kilowatt hour. And basically, there's no upside. It's what we're doing there is converting a variable revenue stream into a fixed revenue stream, which we hope is an attractive thing for developers in order to make their projects more bankable. It removes some of the risk on the developer's side of the net metering credit plummeting or REC prices plummeting.
And those numbers that were in the slides, are those just illustrative, or are the ceilings that you showed in the slides, are those more or less what you expect to be offering?
Yeah, so the 10 cent per kilowatt hour that I showed in the CFD example, that was illustrative. The ceiling prices slide, that's kind of the approach that we're going to be using. We will be updating those numbers based on market inputs before we launch this program. So those are provisional, but that is the approach that we will be taking. So they're real, but subject to change because of updated inputs.
Yeah, I can add a little bit to that, Mark and Sam, is that if we were to have the offering tomorrow, those would be the prices we would be using. If we hear some feedback from the community that need to be some changes to the overall program based on this webinar, that might impact the way the pricing is developed. But based on how we've put it together now, and if we were holding this thing tomorrow, that would be the price that we would show for caps.
Robert Romine is asking where the 100 megawatt target came from.
So we just kind of looked at where our load is now. We want to kind of start small with this program, so we don't want to have too much of our load under contract as we're sort of ramping up here. And so from that perspective, 20 to 30 megawatts a year seemed like a pretty good way to start. And if you multiply 20 times 5 years, then we hit 100 megawatts, and just so happens it's by 2030. Two round numbers, so we decided to go with that.
The tyranny of the base 10 system.
Yes.
But is it possible that this could expand if your load is expanding?
Yeah, absolutely.
Couple comments in the Q&A. So one comment from someone who's anonymous says the term needs to be 20 years if you're hoping that solar projects are going to participate. And then Andrew Keller suggests that you could reduce the size of the security deposit by asking projects to make sure that they're submitting projects that have site control, an assigned ISA, state and local permits in place, and other similar sort of project development milestones.
Yep.
Okay, we're sort of winding toward the end of the questions. Is there any further questions that folks want to ask ask Mark and Brian? Or are there questions, Brian, that I missed that were posed earlier in the Q&A that hit on something different than what we've already gone through?
Yeah, so maybe you're not seeing these ones.
Correct.
There was some questions around low to moderate income projects. I think if someone was able to find a way to leverage benefits because you're serving low to moderate income, and you would want to participate in this, the avoided cost caps are what there's not a different evaluation for low to moderate income, or at least we're not thinking of one. If there's something that you think we should be making a carve out for or something like that, please let us know. But if you're able to get a benefit by serving those members, then you would have an advantage, I think, in this offering.
Yeah, and I can just jump in on that too. So the way I think of the LMI projects, for group net metering, they get an additional 2.5 cents per kilowatt hour. So that would basically increase, if you think about that REC CFD graph that I showed, that would increase the net metering credit, excuse me, by 2.5 cents. So it pushes that line up. And then there are often, there's often grant funding for these projects and bonus tax credits at the federal level that could help reduce the strike price of those projects as well. So yeah, there's no conflict there. If anything, it makes the additional incentives make those projects potentially more attractive, although they may be more expensive to develop and build as well. So we could certainly work with those within the group net metering construct.
All right, so Beth has copy and pasted the questions that I missed up into our chat, so I'm just looking at them now. So one question, so I'll sort of try to rephrase one from Dan Roy here. The question is, what happens if Eversource comes back with, an 8-cent default service rate next spring? I think more broadly, the question is, if we see large fluctuations where prices drop substantially, does that change how this program is structured in any way?
I would say the answer there is no. I mean, the whole idea of at least the REC CFD component is to help isolate developers from that risk. So if the default supply rate drops, That means we pay more in rec prices in order to keep your revenue stream fixed. We've run some numbers based on historical data, done some Monte Carlo simulations, and I think in general we're fairly comfortable with the likely rec prices that we would have to pay through that mechanism. And again, the idea is to convert that variable revenue stream into a fixed revenue stream for you all and remove that risk in order to help these projects get built.
I can add to that a little bit, Mark, too, because I think Dan might also be asking, our avoided costs price cap, would that maybe get modified if we saw?
I see.
Yeah. And we have taken that into account, Dan, that we do expect that number to move around. If that was to get down to the 8.4 cents, which you highlighted here for the February rate, I wouldn't expect to see that avoided cost number that we had put there to move all that much. It could come down a little bit, but not all that much.
Yeah, and just to build on that, so every successive RFP each year will obviously have different price cap numbers depending on what the current conditions are in the market. So it's not like we're setting these ceiling prices once and then each subsequent RFP uses the same numbers.
All right. So to understand better, CPCNH is offering, can a municipality that's a member of CPCNH be prohibited or unable to directly contract with a solar project outside of the solicitation? Must they go through CPCNH? I think I know the answer to this one.
Brian should probably take this one.
I'm
not sure I completely understand the question.
Well, let's just say you've got, I'm going to try to rephrase. There are a couple typos in there, so I'm not 100% sure I've got it right. But I think what this questioner is asking is, are they still able to do a standard traditional group net metering deal directly with a municipality if that municipality is a CPCNH member?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Go ahead.
Sorry, I had misunderstood as well. Like they don't have to go through us. This is just, one way to do it. In fact, a lot of our members are already participating in group net metering projects that presumably many of you all have developed and recruited our members as group members, and that's great. So it's not a either or. They can do both or one or the other.
All right, I think there's one more question that was from earlier where I missed, and I'm again not 100% sure if I know the answer to this one or what it means, but when you were deciding on pricing, what unleveraged IRR were you solving for? Were you expecting developers to receive a 40% ITC to meet those numbers?
So that's not how we came up with the pricing. The pricing is purely value-based. So we looked at the value that we receive from these projects by avoiding, having to purchase power in the wholesale market. The question sort of implies more of a cost-based approach. And we can look at that to see if, I think we would use that approach to kind of figure out whether, or get a better sense for whether developers are likely to be able to hit these ceiling prices or beat the ceiling prices. But that's not how we set the ceiling prices. The ceiling prices themselves are based purely on the value of these projects to us. So IRR really doesn't come into that.
Okay, so question here about LMI community solar projects, which is essentially if there were a group net metered project that was taking advantage of that 2.5 cent LMI adder, who would do the annual reporting if such a project were to come in through your program?
Yeah, so that's I'm glad someone asked that question because I sort of skipped over that. I did mention that one of the ways we could potentially add value would be to help form the group and manage the group over time. I think at this point we are willing to do as little of that or as much of that as is necessary. So if you've got a project where the developer's already done all the legwork in terms of rounding up subscribers, that's great. We'll work with that. Or if a developer has a project that, you know, they think they might want to do group net metering, but they haven't done any of that work yet, they can come to us. We would probably be willing to take that on. We do realize that providing that service, it comes at a cost. In other words, it provides some value to the developers. So I think we'd hope to see maybe a little bit better pricing as a result of that. But that is legwork that we could do on our end.
And just so it's clear what's being contemplated in this question, that would be a somewhat different. I think one of the conceits of the group net metering contract for differences program is that you all have a special relationship with your municipal members, and so you're well positioned to do that group administration. Whereas an LMI community solar project may be working with residential meters as opposed to municipal meters, and so just wanted to make sure that was flagged.
Yep. Understood.
And it's coming from Jude Nuru, from who he put that in from Revision. So it sounds like the answer to the question, maybe to simplify, is that yes, you all would consider doing that administrative work,
Yep.
potentially, but potentially would hope to see a more competitive price as part of that deal.
Yep, you got it.
Okay, now I truly do think I've gotten to the end of the questions. Anything further from the audience?
I forgot to ask this earlier, Sam. I do hope there's a way for us to see all these questions after the fact, right?
We should get them. Well, so two things. One is that folks who are on the call, we are going to post this recording up on our YouTube channel. So you should be able to share it with anyone else on your team who was not able to attend, or others in the development community. So that's one way. We should get a report at the end. We should get a text version of all the Q&A, which I think we could commit to uploading as part of the description in the YouTube post. And if you all, Mark and Brian, if you'd like, we could work to maybe put some concise text answers under those questions as we put them up. If you'd like to approach it that way.
Yeah, that sounds great. I myself have not been looking at the questions, so I'd really appreciate being able to see a download at some point. Yeah.
And I think too, Sam, just a reminder to folks that Mark, you please email Mark if there are additional questions you didn't get to answer any, or you think of some after pondering on this. Please get them over to us, because it's important that we think about those.
And Mark, do you want to flash your your email up on the screen again?
Yep. mark.bolinger@communitypowernh.gov. All
right. Folks, I'm not seeing one more question, and then I think we'll call it. So from Robert Romine, regard to the contract, if CPCNH wants to have it be standard and non-negotiable, perhaps it would be a good idea to do an RFI before the first RFP and incorporate changes that would be appropriate.
Yeah, that's probably a good idea. It would take a little time, so we'd have to kind of get on that pretty quickly. But yeah, that's something that we will definitely consider. Good idea.
Great. Okay, thanks all, and hope anyone who is not attending the LES conference or was not planning to attend the LES conference has reconsidered. I hope to see you tomorrow.
See you all tomorrow. Thanks again.
Be well, everyone.
Bye-bye.